If I meet and have met people of the same sex who have been in a relationship for 40, sometimes 50 years, in my book I was trying to say, how can this be so different?
In August 2014, images of police entering Cliff Richard's apartment appeared on television before millions of viewers across Britain. Overhead, a BBC helicopter tracked the search as though a verdict had already been delivered before the investigation was even complete. Cliff Richard was in Portugal at the time. He had not been arrested, charged, or convicted. Yet in the court of public opinion, the line between a person under investigation and a guilty man had all but disappeared. Nearly 2 years later, prosecutors concluded that there was insufficient evidence to charge him. Cliff would also win his lawsuit against the BBC and the police for violating his privacy. But just when it seemed his reputation had been restored, a statement made by Cliff himself pulled him into a new wave of outrage. What crucial truths did the public overlook because of the 2014 scandal? Or is Cliff's lifelong refusal to explain his private life the very reason those mysteries still endure? In August 2014, high above England, a BBC helicopter circled Cliff Richard's apartment. Its camera pointed down at the building, recording every movement as police officers entered the property. This was not a scene from a crime drama, nor was it a reconstruction filmed after a verdict had been reached. It was happening in real time before millions of viewers. At that moment, Cliff Richard was in Portugal. He was not inside the apartment. He had not been arrested, had not been charged, and had not faced any judgment from a court. But on television, those facts seemed almost irrelevant. Police were investigating allegations of sexual abuse said to have taken place decades earlier. The nature of the allegations alone was serious enough to command public attention. But broadcasting the search live pushed the episode far beyond the boundaries of an ordinary investigation. Images of police at Cliff's home quickly flooded the press. News programs replayed the aerial footage again and again. Headlines appeared before investigators had reached any conclusion. Frame by frame, the coverage seemed to construct a silent narrative in which the man under investigation already carried the outline of a guilty one. In the eyes of many viewers, the distinction between accusation and evidence began to dissolve. That is the terrifying power of an image. An explanation can be ignored. A legal statement can be forgotten. But the sight of police walking through the door of a famous person's home is difficult to erase from memory. For Cliff Richard, the consequences came almost immediately. For decades, he had cultivated the image of a calm, courteous, scandal-free performer. He was not merely a successful singer. To the British public, Cliff had become a familiar part of the country's cultural life, a face present across generations. Yet within hours, that entire history had been pushed into the background. The public was no longer looking at the artist who had sold hundreds of millions of records. They saw only a home being searched and an unanswered question surrounding allegations from the past. The investigation lasted nearly 2 years. For Cliff, it was a period of suspended existence, his reputation hanging between suspicions that had never been proven. There was no formal verdict, but pressure from the media and the public created another kind of judgment, faster, harsher, and far more difficult to control. In the end, prosecutors concluded that there was insufficient evidence to charge Cliff Richard. He did not stand trial. No criminal case was brought before a court. In legal terms, Cliff was not convicted and faced no punishment. But legal exoneration did not make every loss disappear. Cliff later sued the BBC and the police, arguing that his privacy had been violated. He won, and the case became the center of a debate far larger than the fate of one singer. On one side stood the press and its right to report on investigations deemed to be in the public interest. On the other stood an individual's right to protect his reputation before any charge had been filed. Between those two principles lay a question Britain could not easily avoid: how innocent can a person truly be considered when images of police searching his home have already been broadcast live to the entire nation? But to understand why that search caused such an earthquake, It is necessary to look back at the man Britain once believed could never be drawn into a scandal like this. Cliff Richard was born in 1940 in British India. His earliest years unfolded in a world far removed from the stage lights the public would later associate with him. After India gained independence, Cliff's family left the country and moved to England. That return did not open the door to an easy life. His family faced poverty deprivation and the uncertainty of people forced to begin again in an unfamiliar place. Cliff grew up in circumstances where the road ahead appeared to be defined by economic limits and social background. Then music appeared as an escape. During those years, his love of singing was more than a pastime. It became the thing that allowed Cliff to imagine another future. On stage, the hardships of ordinary life briefly receded. A boy from a poor family could stand before a crowd and become someone entirely different. Then came Move It. The song transformed Cliff Richard into one of Britain's first major rock stars. It was more than a hit. It announced the arrival of a new figure in British music at a time when rock and roll was still shaping its influence over a younger generation. From that turning point, Cliff's career expanded at a pace few could have imagined. He did not disappear after a handful of successful songs. Instead, he remained present in popular music for decades. As tastes changed and new generations of performers emerged, Cliff continued to record, perform, and hold his place in the public imagination. Over time, his record sales surpassed 250 million. That figure placed him among the most successful artists in British music history. But Cliff's influence could not be measured by sales alone. He became a familiar presence on television, on stage, and at major moments in the country's entertainment life. Those contributions eventually earned him a knighthood. The boy who had grown up in poverty became Sir Cliff Richard, an icon recognized not only by his fans, but by Britain itself. Yet music was not the only thing that made Cliff's public image unusual. In an industry so often defined by public breakups, addiction scandal, and collapse, Cliff maintained an image that seemed almost designed in opposition to all of it. He appeared courteous, controlled, and rarely allowed his private life to become public property. Across generations, he came to be regarded as a safe figure, an artist known by parents, children, and even grandparents, a star who did not need a constant supply of scandal to remain visible. That is why the appearance of police at Cliff's home in 2014 was shocking for reasons that went beyond the allegations themselves. The shock came from the violent contrast between the man the public believed it knew and the images unfolding on television. For more than half a century, Cliff had represented respectability. Within a few hours, that respectability was buried beneath suspicion. It was the moment when a glorious past no longer had the power to protect the present. The awards, the sales, the knighthood, and decades of contribution could not stop viewers from looking at the search department and drawing conclusions of their own. But that same history also hardened Cliff's determination to fight the way he had been treated. He was not merely defending the name of a star, he was fighting to preserve the honor of the man he had spent a lifetime building. In the end, Cliff escaped prosecution and prevailed in his privacy battle. For many people, that should have been the conclusion. A man suspected, but never convicted, had finally stepped out of the shadows. But the story did not end there. Cliff had survived the threat of prosecution, yet when he finally spoke about what he had endured, his words opened a new confrontation, this time not with the police or the BBC, but with the public itself. In 2018, Cliff Richard appeared on the television program Loose Women. 4 years had passed since the search. The investigation was over. Prosecutors had found insufficient evidence to charge him. Cliff had also secured a legal victory over the BBC and the police, but the wounds of those years appeared to remain open. On the program, Cliff spoke about the experience of being falsely accused and the damage it had caused. For him, the absence of charges could not erase the years of fear, sleeplessness, and helplessness as other people told his story for him. Then Cliff made a statement that changed the entire interview.
I would rather 10 guilty people escape than one innocent person suffer.
To Cliff, the remark appeared to express his deepest fear that an innocent person could be destroyed by an accusation. To many others, however, it carried an entirely different meaning. The backlash was almost immediate. Members of the public and organizations representing survivors argued that Cliff's words minimized the consequences faced by victims of abuse. In their view, accepting that guilty offenders might evade punishment was not merely a legal abstraction. It could mean that victims remained unprotected and unheard. A man once seen as the victim of premature judgment was now criticized for appearing to place his own suffering above the pain of others. The debate intensified quickly. Cliff's supporters argued that he was invoking an old principle of justice. An innocent person must not be condemned, even if society must accept the risk that some guilty people will go free. His critics countered that he had expressed that principle in an extreme and insensitive way, particularly in a climate where survivors of abuse already faced enormous barriers when attempting to speak. And at the center of the dispute, Cliff's personal experience became a double-edged sword. Because he had been accused, he understood the destructive force of suspicion. But because he remained so focused on his own injury, critics said he failed to see the fear carried by those who had been abused. One sentence altered the way the public viewed his legal victory. Before that moment, Cliff had been the man who defeated a media system accused of crossing a line. After his 2018 remarks, he was recast as someone lacking sensitivity towards sexual abuse. The shift was swift and ruthless. Just as in 2014, the public once again came to see Cliff through a single moment. The difference was that this time it was not an image of police outside his apartment. It was his own words. Over the long period of pressure, Cliff's health began to deteriorate. He lost weight. Prolonged insomnia exhausted both his body and his mind. He developed shingles, an illness that can become more severe when the body is under intense stress. For a man who had spent almost his entire life on stage, retreating from the spotlight was not simply a matter of taking a break. The stage had once allowed Cliff to escape poverty. It was the place that transformed him from an unknown boy into a national icon. But after the investigation and the controversies that followed, the light no longer felt entirely like shelter. It was also a place where every gesture, every sentence, and every silence could be examined. Cliff gradually reduced his public activity. He appeared less often. Conversations about the investigation became more guarded, but silence did not make the questions disappear. Instead, as Cliff retreated from public view, the media returned to the oldest mystery of his life, who was the man behind the public image. For decades, there has been one part of Cliff Richard's life the public has never truly been allowed to enter. He has never married. Cliff also has no children. His surviving relatives live privately and rarely appear in media stories surrounding the singer. In a world where the personal lives of celebrities are routinely converted into public content, Cliff's secrecy became unusual. The public knew his songs. They knew the stages on which he had performed. They knew the number of records he had sold and the honors he had received. Yet behind those achievements, Cliff's private life remained almost entirely sealed off, like a locked room. And into that silence came speculation. For years, the media repeatedly questioned his sexuality. The fact that Cliff had never married and had not publicly discussed intimate relationships became raw material for theories that endured across generations. But Cliff never provided the explanation the press demanded. He did not confirm the rumors, nor did he deny them in a way that could permanently end the speculation. In a statement reported by Pink News, Cliff said,
I don't mind talking about things, but there are things that are mine, that will go with me to my grave. I don't talk about my family. I certainly don't talk about my sexuality.
For Cliff, that was a boundary. After decades in public life, he still wanted to preserve a part of himself that did not belong to audiences, newspapers, or anyone else. He could give fans his voice, his performances, and his career. That did not mean he was required to give them his private life. But in the world of celebrity, silence is rarely accepted as mere silence. Each time Cliff refused to answer, new theories emerged. Each time he defended his privacy, the public asked what he was protecting so fiercely. His discretion helped sustain his scandal-free image for decades. Yet it also helped create one of the most persistent mysteries in British entertainment. The contradiction is almost impossible to resolve. If Cliff answers, he abandons a boundary he has defended his entire life. If he remains silent, that empty space will continue to be filled by rumor. Neither choice truly closes the story. His lawsuit against the BBC and the police showed how fiercely Cliff was prepared to defend privacy. He objected to his apartment being turned into a television spectacle before any allegation had been proven. But even after winning in court, he could not control how the public thought about him. The law can define the limits of the press. A judgment can declare that privacy was violated. But no court can prevent questions from continuing to live in the minds of viewers. Cliff's silence, therefore, carries two meanings at once. It is a shield protecting the most private part of his life, but it is also the darkness in which rumor continues to grow. As he grew older and his health became a more serious concern, the question of those secrets became sharper. Would Cliff ever change his mind? Would he one day tell his own story in words never before made public? Or, as he had declared, would everything end with him? As age and illness began to shape the final years of his life, the question was no longer simply what Cliff might be hiding, but whether he would ever reconsider his decision to take those secrets to the grave. Cliff Richard has fought many battles in his life. He fought poverty. He endured the brutal changes of the music industry. He watched his reputation collapse on television before any legal conclusion had been reached. And then he had to fight illness. Cliff was successfully treated for prostate cancer. For a man who had already endured immense psychological pressure, the diagnosis marked a different kind of trial, one that came not from the media or public opinion, but from his own body. Still, Cliff continued to perform. At the age of 85, he remained on stage before audiences who had followed him for decades. For many, the sight became evidence of an artist's extraordinary endurance, a man who had lived almost his entire life through music. The stage remained the place to which Cliff returned. From the poverty of his childhood to the final years of his career, music had been the thread connecting every chapter of his life. It lifted him out of hardship, transformed him into a legend, and remained beside him after scandal, litigation, and disease. Yet returning to performance did not mean Cliff was prepared to reopen the most painful chapters of his past. He continued to live privately. Cliff avoided revisiting the details of the 2014 investigation. He rarely returned to the images of his apartment being searched, or to his legal battle with the BBC and the police. Nor did he further explain his controversial 2018 remarks on loose women in a way that could bring the argument to a definitive end. And his personal life remained behind a closed door. Questions about marriage, family, and sexuality continued, but Cliff did not alter his position. He gave no indication that he intended to provide the public with a final answer. As a result, the story of Cliff Richard became a stack of competing images. A boy born in British India, forced to leave with his family after Indian independence. A poor young man who discovered a route out of hardship through music. One of Britain's first rock stars, launched by Move It. A legend who sold more than 250 million records and received a knighthood. A scandal-free icon dragged into a public investigation in 2014. A man whom prosecutors determined could not be charged because the evidence was insufficient. A plaintiff who defeated the BBC and the police in a privacy battle. a public figure condemned for his remarks in 2018, and finally, an 85-year-old man still performing, yet still refusing to let the public enter the most private part of his life. No single one of those images can explain the whole of Cliff Richard. Look only at the musical achievements and the controversies disappear. Look only at the search and decades of contribution are obscured. Look only at the legal victory, and it becomes easy to forget the statement that drew widespread criticism. And look only at the rumors surrounding his private life, and silence itself can be transformed into evidence for something never confirmed. That is why the story of Cliff Richard has never been simple. The law cleared him, but it could not erase from public memory the image of police entering his apartment. He won the battle for privacy, but he could not stop the media from continuing to question his personal life. He survived cancer and returned to the stage, but the old mysteries still followed every appearance of his name. Perhaps Cliff's life is best understood as a prolonged confrontation between the public man and the private one. The public believes that a star who has spent more than half a century under the lights owes an explanation for the blank spaces in his story. Cliff believes that fame does not require the surrender of every secret. Neither side has fully retreated. The audience continues to ask. Cliff continues to remain silent. And in the space between them, the controversy survives. Cliff Richard will always be remembered as a musical legend, and for everything he contributed, even if the greatest mysteries of his life are never answered by the man himself.